John Russell, thanks for doing this podcast.
It's not done yet.
Tell me your story.
I need some leading questions.
Well, so people probably don't know how we know each other. And we've worked together and been friends for over 25 years. And I got my start in filmmaking because of you. You kind of gave me my first shot. And I'd love for people to hear kind of how you started out in photography, your background, how'd you learn what you taught me?
Sure. Well, I went to college and I graduated. And at that point, it was staying out of Vietnam. I graduated in 68. And so I got into the Air Force Reserve, and so I didn't have to go to Vietnam, which was a huge gift. And instead, I went out looking for a job. I had really no marketable talents. I hadn't had any grad school and all that. So somehow I ended up getting a job selling ski bobs. And a ski bob was like a bicycle, but instead of wheels, it had skis on it. So I drove around trying to get them to be allowed to be on ski areas and ran up against a lot of closed doors and closed minds, and rightly so. It was kind of a sham and all. But during that time, I was working for a company that had engaged Jean-Claude Keely, who in 1968 had won 3 gold medals at Grenoble, and he was certainly the hottest thing in skiing. And he was endorsing this particular ski bob company. And so I got a chance we went up with Jean-Claude to film him, and I had a still camera. And so while they were doing the filming of Keely, I did stills and started to build a little portfolio and establish a little bit of acquaintance with Keely. And of course, everybody wanted a part of him. And so then the ski bob company went under. But I had started to build a little portfolio of shots, and then lo and behold, the ski area of Breckenridge, where I just happened to be sort of living with a friend and all that, he became the endorser for Breckenridge. And so all of a sudden, I parlayed this little bit of friendship I had and started to drive him to and from the airport and all that. And at that point, there was a cinematographer named Roger Brown, who was, I think, about 12, 14 years older than me, who had gone to Dartmouth, where I'd gone. I asked him if I could sort of tag along as he was filming Keely and all that at Breckenridge, and he said, sure, come along. And so I totally stayed out of the way, but I watched and saw how he worked, how he engaged Keely and where he put the camera and where he put the light and all that. And then after that gig was done, I don't know if he invited me or I invited myself to come along as he was shooting a lot of there was a famous series of films that they did, ski films called, one of them was the Mobius Flip and Ski the Outer Limits, and they had guys like Tom Leroy and I mean, this is such ancient history, but these were the guys that did the early aerials and flips and all that. So once again, I'd watch where he put his cameras there, and then every once in a while he'd let me be right next to the as they were filming, and I was shooting my stills. So obviously, I built this incredible portfolio of these ski stars that I would have never had access to, except through Roger Brown. And so he, you could talk about a mentor, but he wasn't a mentor because it was more, I would say, in the style of the Middle Ages or the Renaissance, where there was a guild master, someone that was a master at his craft, and he would have these apprentices that worked for him. And I doubt that the apprentices, it wasn't didactic in terms of them saying you need to do this and all that. They watched the master work, and then when he'd go away, then they might continue the work, but in his style. Back then, they weren't videographers, they were cinematographers, shooting film, of course, as was I, shooting stills. And so I watched a cinematographer work and said, well, that clearly applies to stills. Of course, the irony would be 20 years later, 20 or more, almost 30 years later, you and I would do the switcheroo, where you were being mentored or watching me work. Yeah, I think you watched me and picked up, how you position the camera, what about light and when does it happen and where does it happen and how do you do pre-production by checking out things in advance and all that. So yeah, so that's how our stories got tied together at the end.
So when you first started shooting, how did you learn ISO? How'd you learn shutter speed? How'd you learn the basics of photography?
Sure. Well, let's see. I guess I got my start, as a lot of folks did, back in the mid 1960s. There was a movie that came out called Blow Up by Michelangelo Antonioni or something like that. And it was about a still photographer based on this fashion photographer, David Bailey, who was a hot thing back in the early 60s in Britain shooting fashion. And they did a movie, and in that, the name of the movie was Blow Up. It was all this black and white photography and going into the darkroom and blowing things up and all that. So right after that, everybody went out and got at that point, it was an Asahi, Honeywell Pentax, or a Nikon and all that, 35 millimeter, and everybody started to get into black and white and shooting that and all that. But I was about 2 or 3 years, as it was with a lot of things, behind the rest of the crowd. And so I didn't do that until a year after I'd graduated from Dartmouth. I'd come back from doing my military thing. And so in my hometown of Columbus, Indiana, there was a huge company called Cummins Engine Company. And they sort of allowed me to work in the darkroom. And so I was never very good in the darkroom, but because I love to shoot. But at the same time, what it allowed me to do is to see the importance of getting a good negative. Because you can't, you have to expose it right, and you have to fill up the frame, and it has to be sharp and all that. Or there's no getting around it. As opposed to now, when you can fix anything in post. Back then you couldn't, and so I think it taught me well, sort of the basics of photography. But I've never been a techie, so all I learned was that's a good exposure when I get the exposure right. And it needs to be sharp, and it needs to be, composed in the frame. So that's about as technical as I got. And of course, as different cameras came along, and I would be at a major tennis tournament like Wimbledon and the French Open and all that, and I would have gotten a new camera, or Canon would have upgraded, or I was going from Nikon to Canon, or this new lens or whatever. I would literally have to go to my friend Takeo Takonuma, the Japanese guy, and say, "Hey, how does this work?" and all that. And everybody would laugh, because here was Russell, who was, renowned as a pretty good tennis photographer, but absolutely, clueless when it came to new equipment. And I remember one time I kept trying to shoot and wouldn't shoot, but I had it on time exposure. And so you can imagine I had to wait 10 seconds till it went off, and that didn't work in, shooting tennis action. So yeah, I was both sort of a goof and then taken seriously as they'd call it Russell light. When I'd come into a tournament, and they would have been there all day long, and I showed up at like 4:30 or something, and they'd say, it must be Russell light. And so anyway.
So one of the things that you taught me early was I only need to know what I need to know about a camera. Mm-hmm. That if it does what you need it to do, then move on. You don't have to know every technical aspect of a camera. And then that really set me free to just shoot what I needed to shoot, and I could get the camera to do what it needed to do.
And I think it's somehow the camera, which is your machine, it disappears and becomes second nature. So you're not thinking about that. You're thinking about what's happening out there with the person or the light and the shot and all that. And if you keep it simple, stupid, then yeah, you're not concerned with the new camera or this or that or whatever. You're simply shooting.
So when you were working with, here's a guy that you worked with who's this huge ski legend. Legend at the time. Had won all these gold medals and all this different stuff. How did you build rapport with somebody like that? You built a relationship with him, obviously, but what did that became kind of a foundation to the larger principles that you've taught me?
Sure. Well, obviously, you can't help but be starstruck. But then all of a sudden, when you spend time with someone, you see that, they get sleepy, they get tired, they get hungry, they get grumpy, and the whole thing. And I remember one of the first times when I went to pick up Keeley from Breckenridge, you had to drive. Probably back then, it might have even been before Eisenhower Tunnel and all that. Drive down to the Denver airport to pick him up, and I remember I picked him up, and immediately, I was, excited, wanted to talk to him, and all. Immediately, he fell asleep, and then he said, he says, "Oh, you should take that as a compliment," And I was going, "Well, okay, I guess I'll take it as a compliment." And then, simply. I was a safe person for him because, everyone else, here he was a ski ambassador and they were falling all over themselves to, do you need this? Do you need that? Boom, boom. How was your sleep? This, that, and whatever. And of course, you do a little bit of that, but when you're around somebody you don't have to talk to, and I mean, there were a couple times where, not that I pissed him off, but I sort of I'd say, well, can I take a picture one more there? And he'd go, oh God, when are you going to be done with this? And, the whole thing. And so I learned that you don't want to overstay your welcome or your relaxed rapport with someone.
So you went from skiing and then that.
Well, yeah. So and then there were all kinds of, gift, things that fell into place for me. At that point, my brother happened to be working for a head ski company, and so they had signed up Keeley. And though I never did any work with Keeley for head ski company, my brother had helped start the tennis division at head ski company, and so they signed up Arthur Ashe. So my first assignment, and I probably didn't even get paid. Was shooting Arthur Ashe playing indoors at some auditorium, and I hope this doesn't come off bad, but it didn't turn out well because he was very dark, and it's a very dark, poorly lit stadium, and so I failed to get any kind of great shot indoors, but the guy that worked for Head said, "Hey Russell, we're going to be going down to Las Vegas to shoot this tennis tournament down there. Will you come along?" And once again, I think they probably paid, who knows what they paid, if anything. I remember I crashed in one of the sales reps' rooms and all that. But it was the first Alan King tennis tournament at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. And so everything that the shoot in Denver wasn't, because it was beautiful. It was outdoors, rich light, this, that, whatever. And so, got some great shots for head, and plus I went to this tournament, and so that started me in shooting tennis. And I think it was the following year, probably the following year, we went back to the tournament, and this time I had credentials and all that, shooting the same folks from head and all that. But at one point, and they used to kid me because they had this, they called it the hospitality tent down there. And I mean, they had standing rib roast and all you could eat, So I spent, most of my time in there. Every once in a while I'd come out and take a photograph or something like that. But at one point, I saw this really cute little boy, and his dad was carrying him. And he was sort of looking back at me as I followed them. And so I snapped a couple pictures and didn't think much about it. And I thought, that's one cute kid. And then the following year, or maybe a couple of years later, all of a sudden I saw this same little kid out hitting on one of the courts with one of the professionals and all that. And so I took some photographs. I think he was 7 or 8 years old at that time, and didn't think anything about it. And then at one point, a dad said, "Hey, will you take a picture of our family and all that?" And then there were 3 or 4 brothers and sisters, and they all played tennis. And I said, "Sure." So I took these snaps of these pictures and just filed them away and all that. Actually, I sent down some shots to them, and I remember the dad said, "What can I pay you for these?" And I said, "Don't worry about paying me. These are just a gift and all that." So anyway, didn't think a thing about it. And it must have been about 7 or 8 years later, 6 or 7 years later. All of a sudden, somebody said, "Did you hear about this kid that plays in cut off, or not cut off, but jean shorts and all that, has long hair, and he just made it to the finals at Stratton Mountain playing against Lendl and was beaten, but he made it." And his name's Agassi. And I said, "God, why does that sound familiar?" And I thought, well, I think that, yeah. So anyway, Lorna, my secretary for 100 years, and we dug around and found these shots that I had of the Agassi family and Andre playing when he was 7 or 8 years old, hitting balls and all that. So at the same time, IMG, International Management Group, who had managed Keeley and all that. I knew all those folks because of Keeley and all. They said, "Hey, will you go down and take some pictures of Andre and all that?" And I mean, he was a wild ass kid, 15 or 16, long hair, and of course, overnight he was given all this money, and he had a I'm not sure what kind of car it was at that point, but all these fancy cars, and still lived at home where with his parents. Where in the living room I'd go over their house and they'd have a parrot that would just shit all over the place and the whole thing, and it was just I mean it was like trailer trash. And here's Andre, probably already a millionaire because of contracts with Nike and all that, but still living at home, and it's a hoot.
But you all became friends. I mean, it wasn't this. Most photographers, they come and shoot a celebrity and they want to promo the photos, but you had a relationship with the Agassis, not just
right. I did, and once again, those things often they go both ways. So he saw me as a sort of an older, I don't know what you'd call it, sort of, I don't know, wisdom figure or whatever at some point, and that I was friends with the family and at ease with them and the whole thing. And so it was easy for him to work with me. At the same time, I remember one time I made some kind of remark about, oh, I know what it was. I met in New York at some point, maybe it was during the U.S. Open, and they were having some kind of a black tie dinner for all the tennis players and all that, and formal and all that, and he went and rented a white tux and tails and a top hat, and it was I don't know whether you'd call it nouveau riche or just I mean such bling that but anyway, and I made some comment about his ill-spent youth, and this was later, and about his taste and all that. Anyway, it pissed him off, and he was with a writer from what magazine? I think Esquire magazine or something. And anyway, as he from his private jet, which they let me on to look at, and then I got off and all that. The writer of the article said their Agassi is shooting me the bird, out of the window and saying that he was talking about my ill spent, and he was seeing me as being judgmental, which of course I am. And yet so we'd course in and out, but it would be also anybody that read Agassi's biography Open. Knew that he had some real dark times, and he had he had a lot going on in his life, and as we all do at some point. And so it when things are bumpy and all that, we sometimes act out in ways that are we look back and say, how could I have ever been that way? And yet we are, and we were, and we have to live with that.
What do you think you were to him?
Well, I think that jumped around because. I think celebrities have a double tough time because, they don't know who they are themselves, and then everybody wants a piece of them. And so anybody that's around, and I was guilty of that too. I remember one time being on in an elevator with Andre's brother Philip, and we were going up, and somebody said, "Are you Andre's brother?" And he goes, "Yeah," and all that. And I remember a line from maybe it was Chuck Colson. He says, that being around power, which celebrity is a form of power, is intoxicating.
From the photography standpoint, once you moved into tennis, you were doing all the big tournaments.
And I'd go for 2 weeks to Wimbledon in London, and then there'd be 2 weeks off, and I'd go back when I started going to the French in '84. And I remember the first time I'd gone to the French Open, I didn't know sort of how it went and all that, but they had these pits behind the either end of the clay courts, where you'd be down in, they call it the tunnel. And the very first match I shot in 1984, and I was not familiar with the tunnels and all that. And you'd look out, there would be a square, rectangle of about 2 feet high and 4 or 5 feet, where maybe two photographers could get in there and shoot, and you're at ground level, right at shoe level. And McEnroe was playing, and during his ball toss, the photographers were, you'd hear the motor drives go like that. Anyway, and McEnroe was super sensitive. I mean, he really was to anything moving or hearing and all that. I mean, the guy was a genius and scary at that. But so when the photographers were tossing the balls, he got and he'd stop and he'd turn and he'd stare at these guys and all that. And I was maybe 10 feet away, but visible to him, and I laughed. And he came over and he said, "You smiling jerk, what are you, And he said something about, meet me after the tournament. Well, anyway, this would have, gone, I would have forgotten about it, everybody else would. But Curry Kirkpatrick, who was a Sports Illustrated writer at that point, found me after the match and said, "What happened?" and all that. And I said, "Well, he did this." Well, anyway, Curry Kirkpatrick wrote this up in Sports Illustrated, and it became, I became a celebrity among the photographers because, McEnroe had gone off on me. And of course, and then I think it was the same year. Later in that year, there was a celebrity tournament out in fancy-ass Aspen, where I lived, and Borg was there, and McEnroe and all that, and so it was really loosey-goosey there. You could be almost anywhere on the court. It wasn't Wimbledon, and I was back behind, right on the back screen and all that, and McEnroe was on the other side of the court, and he was practicing his serves. And to this day, I'm pretty sure he saw me over there, recognized me. And so one of his serves, I mean, it didn't even come close to hitting, in the court. It was right at me, I don't know what, it was 100 miles an hour and the whole thing. And I quickly, I looked over there and I said, "Oh, got to get out." So I got out of there. And, but then about, 3 or 4 years later, when he semi-retired, he became a broadcaster for NBC at Wimbledon, where I was. And so we were back. And at the same time, he had started coming over here to the Big Island. So we started talking about the Big Island. And, to this day, I don't know if he put all three of those stories together. But, yeah. So Johnny Mac.
So when you were running but you also were doing tennis, but you were also doing, you've shot multiple covers of Ski Magazine, Outside Magazine. You were shooting all this other stuff at the same time. So It wasn't just tennis.
Right.
So how do you end up getting those jobs? Those are covers of magazines. They're not, those are.
Well, you don't get a job. Most covers of magazine, there would be for like World Tennis at that point, or ski or skiing. Those were all spec. And so unless they assigned you to do a studio shot, which happened once or twice and all that. But everyone would submit, and you'd go like, well, I hope they choose mine, obviously. And that was an interesting thing for me. The fact that I could go to Carl's Pharmacy in Aspen and possibly have a ski cover, a World Tennis cover, a family fun cover, an outdoor cover, and all that. And that's when I realized that I was a praise junkie, because I would sit there and maybe have 4 different covers there, but then saying, well, why in the hell didn't I get this cover over here because somebody else? And I realized, and that's one of the things that eventually why I found myself being drawn and moving to Hawaii, was because I don't think I was my best self when I was competitive, and I was competitive and all that. And when you're competitive, you're protective of, your space and all that. And, that doesn't make for a healthy, congenial self, because and clearly I came to realize that I was a praise junkie, and I was also a control freak and all that. And those things are all driven by, an unconscious fear that, somebody's going to take your ball. This is my ball and the whole thing. So, and it continued for a long time until I think I finally started to deal with it and see what was happening, and then I could address it for the first time. But didn't know that I didn't know that I didn't know.
What did you love about, and what do you love about photography?
Well, I think that it's not so much a love as a driven sort of passion that can be a beautiful thing, but it also can be, it can take you away from, family, which, I consider myself a great family man. In some senses, I was. But my kids, I don't know whether it was ever a joke and all that. It became, dad's never home. He's always gone. And, I'd be off 2 weeks here, 2 weeks there, go to Europe for, in the winter for a World Cup skiing or something like that. So, yeah. And I think that the thing that's hard about traveling, I remember an article, wasn't so much being gone, but when you come back, the re-entry, because, you're coming back and these folks are saying, well, Dad, we've been getting along fine without you, and then I come in and try to control, and they're, you feel this pushback and maybe a little resentment and all that. So it's something I've had to deal with my kids in terms, and clear it up and all that. But and you're not conscious of it. You're not, So for a man or a woman, but I can only speak from a man, to find his vocation, that which he is called to do, he's been gifted in, I think is rare and beautiful. I got it very, very early. I remember it must have been about 76 or something like that, 77. I was at the U.S. Open, and all of a sudden this guy came up to me and said, "Are you John Russell?" And I went, "Yeah." And I think I was sitting underneath a tree with my cameras there, and he said, "Hi, my name's Doug Holliday, and I'm with a group out of Washington. And I've been out to Aspen a couple times, and I've tried to meet you, but I've never been there and all that." And so we're talking along, and here I am, and probably about turning 30, and or maybe more, and he says, "Oh, you're a photographer. What a cool ministry." And I went, "Ministry?" I thought, that's a weird concept. I thought ministry would be, going in the mission field to Africa and all that. But what an affirming thing that was for me to hear early, that, because I was a relatively new believer, Christian, whatever you want to call it, and to hear that, and that's clearly what we're supposed to do. Our vocation, our calling is not our job, but it's our calling, and we're gifted for that. And then only recently, I think I've come to realize that my vocation is not photography. My vocation is, building relationships with people and giving people joy. And my camera has just become the most incredible vehicle for that, which I'm so grateful for. That, but it's not the photography. It's what happens around the photography. I've got a garage full of old slides and tear sheets, of huge jobs I've had, and a lot of them were big paydays and all that. And you know what? Nobody remembers any of those things. I think a week after you've done them, they're pretty much gone. But if you take a picture of someone's grandkid, and I invariably get that, "Hey, we still got your photo," and obviously that strokes your ego, but a different part of your ego, I think, that it's to say, I'm being used, even when I was a jerk, that, that for me, I would put myself in the ultra jerk category for many, many years in terms of being competitive, critical, and always comparing myself to other people. And it's nice to partially outgrow that, because you finally see that that's, my God, other people saw it, but I didn't see it until you're made to see it.
Yeah. So speaking of the photography thing, the outdoor side too, you got into shooting for Patagonia early, the clothing company. Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, I didn't get into it. I mean, it fell into my lap, or I don't know how to. So I happened to be down at a ski show in Las Vegas. It happened every year, and you'd go there, and all the manufacturers would have their booths, and they'd have slideshows going on, or videos, or big posters and all that. And I was shooting for some of the bigger companies at that point, and Solomon, and off and on. Anyway, but every morning, because very few of us liked that scene, we'd go out to the Red Rocks area, Calico Basin and Red Rocks and all that, which is just like one of the most beautiful places in the world. And it was juxtaposed to the most garish place in the world. And so we went out to the Calico Basin, I think that's what it was called, out in the Red Rocks area, and happened upon Yvon Chouinard and his wife Melinda, and I'm not sure who else was there, but and they were climbing, bouldering, just on these little bouldering problems and all that. So anyway, within a period of 20 minutes, I took some shots of him sort of wedged in a rock wedge and all that. And I'm not sure how this happened, but Chouinard and I were laying down flat on the ground, and I had my foot on a picture's worth 1,000 words. I'll go get that later on. Anyway, and here's this icon that everybody just worships and all that. And I wasn't a climber, so I didn't give a rat's rear who he was and the whole thing.
But you became friends with Chouinard. I mean, the picture you're talking about, you actually put your foot on his face.
No, it was his head.
And so this relationship started with him, but then you started sending photos in, because back then their catalogs were all you just submit and
right.
But you weren't paid for those.
So no, you weren't paid for those things. You were paid, but you weren't assigned. And so everybody sent in, so nobody took me seriously. Once again, not, except I did really, great photos that they liked. And my photos, especially with Patagonia, were always pretty goofy, because I wasn't a Patagoniac. I didn't bivouac on the side of hills. There was a line in the interview that said, if I couldn't shoot it from the back of my Wagoneer, it wasn't worth shooting. Whereas, Ridgway had been to, 7 summits and, and that wasn't who I was, but I did have a sense of humor and could goof on them, because I didn't take myself seriously as an outdoor, I was not an adventure expedition guy and the whole thing. So I didn't have to compete in that area.
I mean, there was a famous shot of a porcupine. Tell me about that.
I had an old English sheepdog, and anyway, it got nailed by a porcupine in our backyard. And so I said, I pulled it, these things out, and I said, this thing will be back. And so I borrowed a 410 shotgun, and one night I posted myself out there in our driveway, and I said, I think this is where that porcupine comes from. And sure enough, I waited and waited, and I had my headlights on and all that. And finally, right at dusk, it started to cross our driveway, and I jumped out of the car, and it ran. Of course, the porcupine can't run. And from my hip, I went boom like that. And I'd hit this porcupine, and it was dead. And so I had this little kid's rain gear, red rain gear with a hood on it and the whole thing. And and Tony Bell, who was my rugby captain friend, shot with me from New Zealand. It was he was getting married later that day. And I think he'd had a bachelor party the night before. But anyway, he came up to get something, and I said, Tony, take this shot for me. So I dressed up in a red rain gear and did the same with the porcupine. And because it was so stiff and all that, I propped it up against a post. And so it's sitting there on this post as I'm over there with my 300 millimeter taking a picture of it. Anyway, I get this call back, not from Jennifer, but from Chouinard. And he said, oh, Russell, he says, we love that shot. He said, I've got friends up in Wyoming who have pet porcupines and all that. And I went, oh, shit. because this one was not a pet. This one was real dead, and you know they weren't into killing animals in the whole thing. That established me as an important because you know I didn't take myself that seriously, and every once in a while I got them to lighten up, and so.
And you shot multiple covers of their catalogs. I mean, at some point, you were the most published photographer in Patagonia's history.
Yeah, and of course, once again, that's what they said, but nobody cares anymore. I mean, because it's all in the past, and the fact is, when that they came out with that book, beautiful book, Unexpected, the first 30 years of their catalog, which became iconic, obviously. There was an interview with me, and it was just about the time. Well, it was the time, in I think 2009, when. Of course, the economy ditched, and so resorts and anything I was shooting over here was pretty much done and all. And but it was a great swan song because Patagonia to me would be the most important company I shot for because it was all about relationships. And there was never an art director. I'd go out and everybody would go out and try to just to make but to get a cover of Patagonia. And when they weren't assigned, you had to it had to be something that really grabbed them.
Those early days when we were started shooting together is when you were really getting a lot of stuff published with them. And I remember we would do jobs where I knew you were making good money on those jobs, really insane money for what I was doing. And you were more excited about that.
Well, that's you bring up. Yeah, that's true. And I think what happens is when you get to the point where you found a formula and people like your stuff, I guess you'd call it the sequel mentality, and it's or a variation on a theme. You find something that works, and whether it's Rocky and you have a sequel, or just figure out a style that people like and you milk it. That's one thing. But one of the things that happens to me, it starts to get stale and redundant. And I remember in that same interview, I said, I could do a ski cover or a ski brochure or almost a campaign with my eyes shut. And I think that's where, and you see this a lot with whether it's a chef or an artist, when you're making it big commercially, you better be doing personal work. Invariably, you hear this story over and over with in any trade that's an art, whether it's chefing and all that a chef will get hot, and then he'll be made head chef, and then all of a sudden he'll open up a branch and another branch, and the next thing you know, he's moved from being a chef to basically sort of making administrative decisions and all that.
I see it in myself, but I also see in other people that you get lazy in the personal work. And so, but it reflects in the professional work.
I'm not sure it shows up in your professional work because I think you can get to a formula. And of course, you've told me things now about how things are created by algorithm that, you're just literally doing repeats of yourself, and you're not even doing it. Someone else can take your algorithms and turn it into they can create a movie that's a TC movie or doc, even though it's, you haven't even seen it, but it's just, it uses the same old techniques and tricks and all.
Yeah, but I do think that there's some stuff that in the early formula, like when you start to figure it out, there's soul in it. And then later on you can feel that's just a formula. It doesn't have heart. Like there's something missing. It's almost like food without the salt. Like I can feel that.
But how does that happen?
Well, because I'm just burnt out on it.
You're burned out, or you've been chasing chasing the wrong wabbit, all this time, and chasing the celebritydom, the sex, power, money, and all that, and we all do it because that's the way of the world. Until all of a sudden somebody hits us upside of the head, or something hits us upside of the head, and we say I love the line from Thomas Merton. He said, we spend our entire lives trying to climb the ladder only to realize that it's leaning against the wrong wall, and that's what we do. Or we don't, or we never get we never get made aware of our false dreams, our chasing after.
But would you say in the beginning there is that, a filmmaker I was talking to recently, very, really, really talented guy. And he said, I just don't, people see you as a filmmaker, that you're validated.
Who's judging that? Someone
Right.
says that oh, but I'm this, but you're this, and they can be wrong about you, can't they?
Absolutely. And that's what
I mean, we know a lot of, well, not we know, but we know of, or been around, or have seen enough movies where people are huge successes and win awards and all that, and you'd say, like, you asked me that question the other day. What was it, or would you rather have done that or Dumb or Dumber?
Yeah, that would you have rather done the Oscar-winning film of 2004 or Dumb and Dumber? Yeah, I think there's something about those early, as you're getting started, though, is getting something that there was something that clicked. I think when I did Rising from Ashes, like I had done films, I had done
Oh, don't bother me. I've seen them. Thank you very
right, but I had
much.
done two features at that point. But there was something when I did Rising from Ashes, and you came over and shot the poster for that. Like, I mean, what people don't know is that I would get up at 2 o'clock in the morning and I'd come in your room and you'd wake up and you'd go, okay, let's talk. And
Okay.
you'd walk me through that because I was just so over my head. And you're like, stay to the main thing. And you would just listen.
Is
But
that when I said, have you seen my watches?
no,
Do you want to watch a movie?
that was a,
That was a
but,
different one?
but I remember being there and it was like nobody on the crew, they had their jobs and you had been there, done that. You'd had your success. You had shot with all these people. You were there. I think you said, I'm the mascot on this thing. And so here you are there, but I needed somebody that could see past all of the hype of the film and documentary and all of that and just say, what's the story? And you really would push me. And I remember you'd listen. And there was nobody there that really could understand that because nobody had been in that position.
And I remember on a couple of occasions there was pushback from you when I was saying it's not so important that you get these 10 cameras on it, but just get there for the right light.
Yeah.
And I remember you would say, well, I can't get Adrian and Josh to get out, and I said, well, okay, you do what you can, but when you do have control. And that's, I think, what a director has to do. He has to be pushing enough that he says, I need Adrian out there at 7:30. He can be in there eating the eggs that he needs and the whole thing. But let's, and for you to exert yourself and get into dicey territory. And you can do it sometimes and sometimes you can't. But, you had so many balls in the air, and so you couldn't see the whole picture. I'm sitting there doing squat, so I don't have anything to do. I'm shooting stills and all that, but I can sort of see this whole thing being played out. And what do you remember? What was the behind the scenes? Yeah,
Yes.
where that comes out, and that's not because I'm wise or this or I just have been there. You've got the experience. Plus, I had a perspective that I didn't have any money in the game.
Yeah.
I was a mascot, and so I could sort of see what you were grappling with, and seeing maybe you should put more energy here. And of course, when you're in the middle of a production, I mean, it's overwhelming, and yet that's where the Zen guy would get in the middle of it and say, I'm going to quiet myself and see what is the real center and the purpose of this movie, because we lose it in practicalities.
Well, and what I realized on that was I I remember I didn't even know what cameras were being released for 3 or 4 years. The audience doesn't care what it was shot on. They don't care about any of that stuff. They care about the journey that they're going to take when they watch this movie. And I remember we ended up with a little DSLR and a boom pole, and then that ended up being a lot of what we shot on that trip, was just stripping everything down and realizing it was just, and I think in the last few years, I've gone away from that. Like, you kind of get sucked into the industry side, and I'm now leaning back into just simplifying it down, trying to be into the.
Francis Ford Coppola, is that how you say it? And his daughter, they were being shot for Louis Vuitton ad. Annie Leibovitz was shooting the ad campaign, and he made a comment that she brought a production crew that was bigger for the still shoot, brought a bigger crew than he did when he was making a movie.
You've taught me that ended up being the principle that more people I see repeating that have heard me say it, and now it's passing it down, is it's all about light and relationships.
The best light. That expression, he put me in the best light, or I see so-and-so in the best light. But then there's a pause about relationships. And, you realize that I can only use that great light and do that great thing with Andre, for instance, if I have access to him. And I only have access to anybody, through relationships. So
Well, I remember we went to Las Vegas, and that was when I was your photo assistant, which you never basically carried around a reflector. I think on the big shoots, I would carry film in a bag, but
and you did it well.
it was amazing opening
You
those
were the
old
bag
wrappers.
man. You were
Yeah.
the bag man.
But you would always let me bring my camera and shoot over your shoulder when it was appropriate. And then they ended up buying that footage later, but that's where I learned the light. But I remember going back to what you said in the beginning about learning about relationships and those things. I remember in Las Vegas, I mean, they spent like $3 million, I think, in 2 days on that tennis. They never left the tennis court. And I remember being out there, and the director was dressed in all Andre's clothes and shoes. And it's 400 people. There's I don't know, 60 by 60 silk on a crane over this thing. I mean, but what was startling to me about that is when Andre and Steffi walked up, they saw the director, they shook his hand, they kept looking over his shoulder, and then they saw you, and they pulled up 2 chairs, they gave you a hug, and they sat on either one of your sides, and they just talked the whole time. And they would go shoot their stuff and come back and sit next to you. And that's when I realized that's the power of relationship. And then they said, "Oh, John, you have your window," or "There's a few minutes, we have a 15-minute break." And you said, "Hey, can we just shoot your stuff right now?" And you just went over, shot it, and you're like, "I'm done." Wow. If you were to, before we close this up, if you were to give some advice to the next generation of creatives that are shooting film, or what would you say as far
No,
as
wait, shooting film or films?
movies, photography? I mean, in this digital age of storytelling, as somebody who's been at it for 50 years, what advice would you give to the next generation of creatives?
Well, it's interesting to me that that word advice is something that the best advice you can give is none, because you don't give advice. I mean, you can make suggestions. Yeah.
Or what would you say? What is your opinion of the creative industry now? As far as you see everybody and shooting and selfies and photography, and everybody's a photographer and all this different stuff. What's your perspective?
Well, everybody's
on
a documentary maker too. I mean,
that's a good point.
It's so easy. I mean, and they used to say that. I mean, I remember when self-focusing lenses came out, and well, it must have been the 80s or something like that, and everybody'd say, well, now everybody can do it, and the whole thing. And then automatic, exposure may have come before that and all that. And with each of these things, and then cameras became totally automatic and self-focusing and all that. But it doesn't really change anything. People say, everybody can be, well, right. But do people take time to compose and get great light and create a great photograph? Well, hell no. All you get is, 10 million. And yeah. Once again, I think you'd have to look at that word, what is driving your creativity? And, I think to be a creative person means to take a lot of chances, to, like Picasso says, steal like an artist. Where you're hell, nobody's original. I mean, Book of Ecclesiastes says that there's nothing new under the sun. But how do you say, oh man, I loved what John Zimmerman did at and I was his photo assistant at Breckenridge at one point. I loved how I saw Roger Brown do this and the whole thing. But then you run it through your filter, with your eyes, and it may be referential, but it's not copying, because you can't do that. And then you start to apply those things, and then they become second nature. And you're not thinking about them and all that. But I would say, what is our motivation to create? Am I trying to? Am I motivated by becoming famous? That would have been me. Didn't really know that. Money, not so much at all. But we're all driven by some need to, I'm not sure what, to succeed. But of course, then that word succeed is a totally bogus concept, because once you've succeeded in something, then what do you do? And what is success? So I would say that you'd have to say, this is sound a little, but what in your heart or your gut is driving you to create? And there are a lot of weird artists out there, and they do great stuff because they're just driven by some kind of muse, M-U-S-E, to create stuff. And if no one can relate to it, is it still art? I don't know. Well, yeah, I guess so. And then this is probably a big word. What's the difference between being in creating something that's not entertainment alone? There's nothing wrong with entertainment, but when that's all you get, and there's no meat there to get your anything to take to grab you by the soul, make you tear up, make you laugh big, and the whole thing, beyond entertainment. So I would say, well, you know what it is? It's creating beauty. I mean, that's the word. It's beauty versus glamour. How do you create beauty, something beautiful, which can be a wrinkly old lady, right? Or someone singing off key, but it's beautiful because it's real and it's soulful and it's authentic, versus being glamorous, which is ephemeral. It's gone.
For the audience, we've been shooting this film Onward for 7 years. I think I've been shooting a little bit every time I come over. So there will be a film of this story at some point. Thanks for doing this, John.
Is it a threat or what?
Thanks for doing this podcast.
Okay.
Till next time.
You're welcome.